It seems to me it's worth sorting out a shift in taste that takes place during the 18th century, because it certainly has some impact on typography. This is the decorative motif, which is known as Rococo, which is found in architectural work and sculpture of the early 18th century, called Rococo in German, and in France by a similar but slightly different name. Its features are asymmetry and curious plant-like forms, which would kind of come to life again under Art Nouveau. But here we have a piece of German plasterwork of about 1720. This is a piece of furniture, or a detail of it, made by Boulle in Paris. And as you see, Rocaille is the preferred French version of the word now. But once again, plants come into it, and it is a very complex style indeed. I'd like to look at just two images. It seems to me that the image by Fragonard that I'm showing here is a perfect capture of the mood. A warm summer afternoon, foliage in a kind of warm mist, and the characters here are a young woman on her swing, her lover half hidden in the bushes in front, and the grey-haired patron, whatever he is, giving her a push on the swing. And as she comes forward, she loses her slipper. Well, this is Fragonard, and luckily for people with access to London, that's where it can be found. The shift in mood at the end of the century is very startling indeed. Jacques-Louis David was not only revolutionary in his politics, but he was actually a member of one of the groups pursuing the ends of the revolution. Here, when he was in Rome, he painted this image of the oath of the family of the Horatii, who defended Rome against an opposing army. And here are three members of one family volunteering to go out as champions against the enemy. The complexity is that one member of the women grouped on the right-hand side is betrothed to a member of the opposing army. Well, it's complex. It was dramatized by Corneille in the 17th century in his tragedy, the Horace. The change of mood is emphasized by the scene. No foliage, no flowers here. It's a simple structure. The arches are of brick, not some valuable stone. The columns are the simplest form of the Roman orders of architecture. In fact, it's simpler than anything that has survived. the Tuscan order, which is, it thumps into the base below without any kind of moulding. It's as near to a sans serif in architectural terms as one could well get. Well, there we are. There are two images to symbolize what's going to take place in typographical terms. I'm going to deal with a printer who certainly left his mark on typography in the most unlikely way in some ways. I'm offering a couple of, not so much source material, but a couple of books which are both well worth having a look at. Valerie Lester, frankly, had no real knowledge of typography, but having heard of Bernoni, thought she would write a book about his life. And since there was no English language biography, I do offer it as something well worth picking up and looking at. The other book, as you see, is considerably earlier. Stendhal, novelist. He wrote about the Charter House of Parma. Well, in many ways it is a kind of romantic novel of the 19th century, but based on the episode that we're going to be looking at. Bernoni doesn't come into it, but another character certainly does. I'm starting with a certain Guillaume Dutillot, who was the prime minister of this little state in Italy, which was self-contained. The Duchy of Parma was governed by members, first of all, of the Farnese family, a papal family, but then passed into the hands of the Bourbon, the French relatives of the French royal family. And at the time we're concerned with, the Duke was, as I say, a member of the Bourbon family, so there was a strong French influence. His Duchess was a daughter of Maria Theresa of Austria, a very different kind of family indeed, but quite complex. Dutillot was indeed French, as his name suggests. He had become a member of the court of the Bourbon family in Spain, because the Spanish royal family was also Bourbon. And when the Duke became the governor of Parma, Dutillot came with him and did a lot to reform, as he saw it, this rather isolated, backward state, but which just happens to be on the main road between Milan and Bologna, and on the way to Florence and Rome. Well, in a way, the book he's holding in his hand does rather suggest where his interests lay. And he was to put Parma on the map, so to speak, as a place where printing happened. First of all, the background. The main palace of the ruling family was this curiously gloomy building put up for the 16th century, rulers of Parma, the Farnese family. And there it is, still standing. The idea of bringing printing to Parma, or let's say distinguished printing, produced an interesting connection. Giambattista Bodoni, who was made director of the Royal Printing Office, had a background in Rome. His family came from Piemonte, near Turin, but he himself had travelled to Rome and for a while had a connection with the missionary press, the Propaganda Fide. Things became difficult there, and he had quit Rome and was on his way to England, where it seemed everything was happening in typography. But on his way he fell ill, and through a Roman connection who had become librarian in Parma, he was recruited as a promising young printer. Well, as you see, he recognized the French connection of Parma, and the first specimen he produced was clearly modelled on the title page of the Bodoni Manuel Typographique. And some of the types he found he had to use in Parma had been imported by Dutillot, who had written off to Fournier, or the Fournier foundry, and obtained some type. Bodoni had learned punch cutting in Rome, and once he had found his feet as a ducal printer, he began to make types of his own, and they are pretty spectacular. This is from a series of capital letters that he produced in the 1780s, and they are astonishing, not only for the shape of the letters, but the quality of the printing, the dense matte black ink that's used too. This is a very rare specimen, as you can imagine, but it does convey something of the quality of his work. I'm showing this because it's exactly what he was not doing, and yet in a way he was, because this is a Dutch type that I've already shown in this series, the work of Christoffel van Dyck, with these curious sort of spiky serifs on letters like S. And Bodoni, in a sense, picked up on this. He was aware of what was going on in Birmingham, in the work of Baskerville. And I'm showing here the type I've just shown you, the big G on the right. But on the left are two others, the French style of doing a capital G and Baskerville's. Now, compare the serifs in each of these letters, and as you'll see in that big letter on the right, Bodoni was picking up to some extent on the English mode of doing it. Similarly, in a curious way, if you look at the specimen he did, the Manuale Tipografico, as he called it, of 1788, here are two italics of the same, for the same body. On the right is one that clearly echoes the rather Romanized style of Fournier. On the left is something that you have to call English. It's like a Baskerville italic with these smooth calligraphic terminals to letters like N and I and M. So his specimen of 1788, which he calls a Manuale Typografico, which was a kind of misunderstanding. Fournier's book, the Manual Typographique, had been intended to be a textbook of printing generally, but in fact it only told you how to make type. Bodoni's Manuale has no text at all, and it shows, I suppose, two things. I mean, it shows his types. There's a kind of national element to it as well. He gives the name of Italian towns as names for his types, and Saluzzo in Piemonte, near Turin, was the town he was born in. And he gives, as you see, the Roman is in Italian. The italics are in French, with a rather ingenious way of fitting an extra S in that there's no room for in this large size. I'm not going to go into the long career of Bodoni. Once he was settled in Parma, he produced luxurious printing, not least for the passing trade. That road from Milan to Bologna was the favourite road, an ancient Roman road, in fact, used by passing tourists, rich tourists. This is a Bodoni book of the 1790s, when he was so secure that he could put his own name into the imprint on the title page. So it's printed in the Royal Palace, but with Bodoni's types. It's also an example of the acreage of white paper that was becoming normal for fine printing of the period. Here is the neoclassical passion for wide open spaces. The idea of keeping the original margins was a kind of obsession among the rich bibliophiles of the day. The books were issued. If you didn't buy them in the original sheets, you could buy them in this curious temporary binding. The advantage was that it kept the sheets sewn up, but with nothing taken off the edge. So the big margins, which were highly praised, were preserved. And here's a nice example. That's as big a page as you can get, because the rough edges left by the decal of the mould have been very, very carefully kept. This is a book that is bound in leather, but the binder has clearly been told not to touch the edge. Keep that margin as big as it goes. And here we are in 1794, and here is the name of Bodoni as the printer, and it's clearly aimed at the travelling rich milords, the English tourists, on their way to Rome. Two showings from that book. And you see that it's not only that the margins are big, but of course the type has been very heavily leaded to make the page about as open and light as it comes. There's the detail. Now, Bodoni's types have already been changing too, probably under the influence of what was going on in France, which we'll look at. the contrast between thick and thin has been enormously increased. And so this is in a way, the Bodoni type that many people are most familiar with. And the book, again, that shows this new style is his second Manuale Tipografico of 1818. That's 5 years after he died. His widow managed to finish it. Everything is more rigid, precise than when it started off. There's the address that he provided for it, the introduction, and there are some of the details. In many ways, I mean, this is one that would become familiar in 20th century versions of a Bodoni type, but it's very much a late development. And the French influence is certainly there too. It's not as rigid as some of the adaptations have made it. If you look at for example, the ascenders, D and L, that's not a rigidly straight line at all. There's a slight curve to it. And on the very, very beautiful wove paper, the result is not nearly as mechanical as later versions of Bodoni's style have made it. You can see some of that detail in this close-up. One curiosity, and I've mentioned this letter before, the lowercase t that Bodoni made was normal in England and in Italy. That T you see below in the American type founder's very mechanized adaptation is nothing to do with Bodoni, but a lot to do with what was going on in France, which we'll look at. As with the Romain du Roi, one of the advantages of Bodoni is that so much of his original material does survive. There's one of his punches, and the matrix that goes with it too. Some of the original cupboards in which they're displayed in Parma were made for Bodoni's type. And I'll close these remarks with an image I have shown before, but this is a piece of typecasting that I did with Stan Nelson, using one of Bodoni's own molds and a matrix left behind by him in Parma. And so this is one of the great typographical collections of Europe. The Didots were a family. I could have added a lot more names here, but this is quite enough. It is a kind of dynasty that went on into the 19th century. But here is the founder of the family, François Ambroise, and he was a publisher and a printer who set up the typographical line we're going to have a look at. He had a brother, Pierre-François, who was his younger brother, and there isn't really time to go into his productions, but he also did fine printing. But I ought perhaps to mention that he had a son, Henri Didot, who learned the cutting of punches, and he made a 3-point type, which can be read. Anyway, let's come back to F.A. Didot l'aîné, the older brother, who had two sons, Pierre and Firmin, and I've put in the names of two punch cutters, professional punch cutters, who had a part in the types associated with this family. Didot l'aîné, the elder Didot, was charmed by the types of Garamond, which were still around and being used, but thought he could do something to improve printing. We're in the 1780s and things they are changing. And this is a book printed by him with some new types. That's the imprint. And if we go into the book itself, it is a new look to the page. The paper, naturally, is wove paper, an English invention, but one which had been taken over in France too. And if we look at the detail of this new type, it's a curiosity. It's not, it doesn't have the thicks and thins of later Didot types. And in some ways, you could say that types like, say, the lowercase g are oddly reminiscent of older French types that could almost be a G by Garamond. But a certain amount of changing is happening too. The T has a crossbar only on the right-hand side. Here's another book with one of the new Didot types. They were made for him by a punch cutter called Vaffleur. And of course, one of the things that strikes one is the exquisite quality of the presswork of this particular type. I have myself a little book printed in these types of Didot l'aîné, which is a curiosity because it's the life of a rather important French king of the 16th century in English. And there was a kind of Anglophilia, a love of English things, not unconnected with the fact that the English had dealt with their monarchy in a rather definitive way. Anyway, here is the life of Henry IV. And it enables me to look at these new types made by Vaffleur in more detail. Exquisite presswork and a kind of rigidity, one has to say. Serifs are absolutely horizontal in ascenders, and there are some odd playings with forms of letters. The T with that bar on the right only, I've mentioned. On the last line you've got an F, fill. Again, the crossbar is only on the right-hand side, and so on. K in the second line is rather curious, but of course it's a letter that never crops up in French. And if this is an English book, it may as well have a K made for it. Here's the italic that goes with it. It's very much the kind of Romanized italic that Fournier was driving at, and in the hands of the Didots, it achieved a kind of, again, a sloped Roman effect. And once again, bottom left, you have a K put in its place. The younger of the two sons learned punch cutting from Vafla, no doubt. And so here is a little book by the elder brother, Pierre Didot, which is a kind of imitation of La Fontaine, but also with a poem about the progress of printing in the hands of the Didot family. And here is Pierre Didot's introduction with the types of his brother, Firmin. Tiny size, about a 9-point type, with these very, very sharp horizontal serifs, giving a kind of crispness to the appearance. Firmin did, in fact, make a type specimen, of which only one copy is known. And this is not the most, the sharpest of images, but it does show that the Didot family had adopted numbers for type bodies. We begin here with the number 7, and the 8, the 9, and the 10. Doesn't say points, but that's what they are. And they had invented their own points, which are based on the traditional pied de roi, the king's foot, of the pre-revolutionary standard. Not good timing, because by 1795 the metric system was underway. But there we are, that is the Didot point. Here's a book printed with the name of Pierre Didot, very much for the market for fine printing of the late 18th century, a Virgil on beautiful wove paper. This is a big book, it's a folio, and we can look at some of the detail going in a bit. And this gives you a close-up then of that top left-hand corner. This in many ways is the sort of the classic version of the Didot type. Great contrast between thick and thin, a certain rigidity to a number of forms. The counters of O and E have a kind of almost a vertical interior to the counter. And notice, of course, that lowercase t, which has come from, 100 years before. Here it is. That's the way it looks in the Romain du Roi. And this is the form that the Didots adopted. And other fine printers like Bodoni and some of the English ones had to decide if they would adopt it. Well, they didn't, but it stayed put in France. One feature of this particular book is worth noticing as we go by. It's number 41. It says, and Pierre Didot, l'aîné, the elder brother, is guaranteeing. This is slightly bizarre, but it's not unfamiliar in fine printing. It's a habit that was taken from people who made etchings, and it's true that if you make a delicate, particularly a dry point etching, the first impression may be much better than the 10th or the 100th. With a letterpress book, this is complete nonsense. The first and the 41st copy will be identical, no way of telling them apart. But collectors do like to know how many were printed of the edition they have. I mustn't leave you with the sense that this is a completely fine printing setup. Here's a little book from Pierre Didot, which is certainly not an expensive one, but it certainly uses the types of his brother. It's worth noticing where they had their printing office too. The Royal Printing Office didn't exist anymore. So there was a nice space in the Louvre, and they took it over. And this little, fairly cheap edition was printed in the Louvre building. The National Printing Office, the Imprimerie Nationale, moved away, and for a while it was even occupying an unused building which became known as the Élysée, but it ended up in what is now known as the Marais district of Paris. Anyway, to go back to the Louvre, here is a book by a certain Denon, who was an art collector, and he made a trip to Egypt. In fact, he made it in company with a certain Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte, who invited him along when he invaded and took over Egypt. And it's a nice example which shows us the Didot type in a less elaborate edition. That's the text version of the type. And that is about an 11-point type. And as you see, it stands up fairly well to the cheaper paper being used. The Didots managed to survive, whatever the regime, and Firmin Didot got himself appointed as the head of the type founding operation in the new imperial printing office of Napoleon. And there's his new type. Almost certainly the making of a new type was tied up with that Egyptian adventure of Napoleon, which had to be printed, in this case the great description of Egypt, printed there, had to be printed beginning in 1809 in the types of Louis XIV, and perhaps that stimulated the idea of making a new type for the emperor. In fact, as far as I can tell, it was only ever used for one book, and that was the ceremonies that took place when he crowned himself in Notre Dame in 1804, and the proceedings were printed in his own type. There he is, by the way, in a very curious costume, which is half Carolingian and half invented, medieval. Very odd indeed. In a sense, Firmin is the Didot we think of, but his brother got into type making. He employed another punch cutter, Vibert, to make him his own type. So this is not Firmin, this is Pierre Didot's Didot, and it has some curiosities. Notice that the accent in the top line, is it acute or grave? Well, it's neither. It's a kind of all-purpose accent. And those curious blobs in the serifs of the C in the second line. Well, there we are. That's a another Didot experimenting with the ideas. In a way, the Didot style became a kind of national form. Here's a very fine, very large type in the specimen of a punch cutter called Mosley. We don't know what his first name was. It's a curious mix of rigidity and flexibility. Notice that these incredibly thin serifs must have been like knife edges, very difficult to cut, very difficult to cast. And yet the tail, you'll see it's extraordinarily subtle, the way it drops down just below the baseline and so on. So this Didot style, or Didot looking type, did actually survive into the 20th century. Here, for example, in the 1950s, the type founders de Bernier-Peignot produced a type which they called Firmin Didot. Is it? No, of course it isn't. This is the type I've just shown you.